Welcome back to T Technology. A MAC address versus an IP address. A MAC address is assigned to every network device. The first 3 bytes denote the vendor. And the IP address is address with unique logical address. Network security. So let's start with a LAN versus a WAN. A LAN is a local area network, typically spanning a single floor or a building, versus a WAN, which is a long-distance connection across geometric remote networks. Moving on to a hub and a switch. A hub is used to connect multiple devices in a network, normally with wired devices. A switch is wired devices. LAN is a virtual local area network. So back to that example of having multiple offices, you can have a logical group of workstations, servers, and network devices that appear to be the same LAN, but they're in different geographic areas. A router and a firewall. A router controls traffic flow on networks and are often used to connect similar networks and control traffic. A firewall is an essential tool in managing, controlling network traffic, and protecting the network used to filter traffic. So a firewall would be sitting right underneath of your router, right above your switch and your workstations. OSI models. So if we start from 1 to 7, that is considered de-encapsulation. And that is the physical layer, the data link layer, the network, transport, session, presentation, and application layer. If we want to encapsulate, then we'd go from 7 to 1. And that is the enforcement of data hiding and code hiding during all phases of software development and operational use. So some examples. So for the presentation layer, that could be like a JPEG or PNG image file. The session could be discussing logical ports. The transport layer is things like TCP or UDP, and the network layer is discussing routers or sending packets. The data link layer are switches, bridge, or sending frames, and the physical layer would be the Ethernet. The functional layers are the application, transport, internet, and network interface layer. They define and protect protocols. They move among devices, and they create and insert packets. Network attacks. So a DDoS attack, prevention of authorized access to resources or delaying of time-critical operations. Fragment is when an attacker fragments traffic in such a way that a system is unable to put data packets back together. An oversized packet is purposely sending a network packet that is larger than expected that can be handled by the receiving system, causing receiving system to useful unexpectedly. Spoofing is an attack with the goal of gaining access to a target system. This would be through the use of a false MAC address, IP, username, or getting within the system itself. A man-in-the-middle attack is an attack where the adversary positions himself between the user and the system to interpret and alter data traveling in between. A virus is the earliest malicious code to plague security admins. 2 functions would be propagation and destruction. The code spreads without consent of a user. A worm is a network security threat with destructive potential as other malicious code propagates without human interaction. A Trojan horse program carrying malicious behind-the-scenes code with potential to wreak and havoc. An on-path attack is an attack where you place yourselves between 2 devices to intercept or modify info intended for on both endpoints. Phishing is a very common attack that attempts to misdirect legitimate users to malicious sites through the abuse of URLs or hyperlinks in emails. Side channels are passive, non-invasive attacks to observe operations of a device and fault analysis attacks. APT is threats that demonstrate unusually high levels of technology and operational sophistication spanning months or even years. Ransomware is malware used for facilitating attack that use cryptography to lock files on effective CPUs and require ransom fee for unlock. An on-path attack is attacking placing themselves between 2 devices, otherwise known as a man-in-the-middle attack. Network protection. Firewalls are the baseline. IPS, intrusion protection system, is a special type of active IDS that auto attempts to detect and block attacks before they reach the target systems. IDS is a form of monitoring to detect abnormal activities. IPS are effective at preventing network-based attacks. An IDS system automates the inspection of logs and real-time system events to detect intrusion attempts and system failures. One goal is to provide a means for timely and accurate response to intrusion. There's two types. The host-based, which monitors a single host or CPU. It detects anomalies, process calls and info, examines events in more detail, and pinpoints specific traffic. The network IDS monitors and evaluates network activity to detect attacks or event anomalies. They support centralized administration and detect attacks on other systems. You want to keep systems and applications up to date. You want to remove or disable unneeded services and protocols. You want to use intrusion detection and prevention systems. A ZenMap is a GUI for in-map security scanners that scans networks to determine everything that is connected as well as other info. And a SIEM, SIEM, gathers log data from sources across an enterprise to understand security concerns and resources. And just to talk about the diagram of how this would work. So you would have the firewall, then you would have the IDS that could be something like a web proxy, then you have the IPS underneath it, then you have an antivirus software and a VPN, and also additional gateways. Some IPS systems, it's better to have IPS over IDS or a combination of both because IPS is placed in line with traffic. All traffic must pass through the IPS and chooses what traffic to forward and what traffic to block and analyze. And like I mentioned before, here is just an example of how a system might look. So you'd have your router on the top with your firewall underneath it. Then you would have your network IPS with your switch, server, wireless access point, etc. underneath that, and then your workstations. Within the workstations, you might have an IDS, an HIDS, and an NIDS, as well as a SIEM that will scan your system. Defense in depth. This is using multiple types of access controls and literal or theoretical layers to help an organization avoid a monolithic security stance. Things like data, which controls or protect data like encryption, data leak, prevention, and an IAM system. And you have your application, which controls and protects the application, things like data leak prevention, firewall, and database monitors. Then your host, which controls an endpoint level, antivirus software, a firewall, and patch management, as well as a configuration detection system. Then you have internal network controls, things that protect data flow and user access, so a additional detection system, a intrusion prevention system as well. Then you have the perimeter, which is more of a physical, and you can have also gateway and firewalls, as well as honeypots, malware analysis, and DMZs, demilitarized zones, as well as some additional physical like locks, walls, and access controls. And finally, you have your policies, which are procedures and awareness that the admins and controls specifically identify risk before they happen. Some other on-prem that you can have is an HVAC system, as well as monitoring of the water and the gas leaks. You can have a proper physical layer over the network, the phones, and special telecom. You can have consistent power and backup devices, fire suppression, redundancy systems that design systems with duplicate components. So if failure occurs, there's always a backup. This works well in hospitals. Cloud computing. So you're probably familiar with AWS. That is cloud computing. Set of computing resources typically sold as a service. Some benefits are that usage is metered and priced according to units consumed. There's reduced cost of ownership because there's no need to buy an asset for everyday use. There's reduced energy and cooling costs because it's set at an optimal use of IT resources and systems, and it can allow for an enterprise to scale up new software and databases, services, solutions through cloud systems quickly without having to install massive hardware locally. It maintains assets ensures functionality, and keeps systems and apps updated with current patches. SaaS. That is a cloud provider due to software applications and distributed model where software apps are hosted by a vendor or cloud provider and made available network resources. Some of the benefits are ease of use and limited minimal admin, auto updates and patch management, no manual patching for security or updates because it's always the newest version, standardization and the same version for all the users. PaaS, it's otherwise known as Platform as a Service. As a cloud provider, offers the middleware for customers to use, build, and operate their own software. It enables customers to rent hardware, operating systems, storage, and network capacity. It allows renting of virtualized servers and associated servers for running existing applications and testing. There's no customer management. Provides toolkit for conveniently developing, deploying, and administering application software structured for scalability. Provides tools for deploying new applications. It maintains computing resources that consumer apps need to operate. It provides benefits for developers. Operating system can be changed and upgraded frequently. Associated features and system services can all be upgraded. Finally is IaaS. That is infrastructure as a service. That's a cloud provides network access to traditional computing resources. The examples would be processing power and storage, computing resource services, storage, and other network operations and other network resources. Some of the benefits are the ability to scale up and down, infrastructure on usage. You can handle spikes and dips within usage and retain system control. Cloud deployment. So there's a public cloud, a private cloud, hybrid cloud, and a community cloud. A public cloud is a cloud infrastructure where it's provisioned for open use by the general public. A private cloud, normally used in things like healthcare, is instead of a publicly shared cloud, it has developed and deployed for a private organization that builds its own cloud. Their hosting within corporate firewall under control of IT department is designed to offer same features as other clouds, but removes a number of objections to cloud computing model to control your data, any security worries, and issue connecting to regulatory compliance. Hybrid cloud, that's a combination of both. Some of the benefits are retaining ownership and oversight of critical tasks and processes, reusing previous investments and technology within the organization, control over critical business components and systems, and it's cost-effective. Finally, the community cloud. That is a system in which the cloud infrastructure is provisioned for exclusive use by a specific community of consumers from the organization have shared concerns, managed by one or more organizations, SLA. That's an agreement between the cloud service provider and the customer. Some points are the exit strategy, data location, disaster recovery process, data security and privacy, system availability and service performance, and more. Network access control. These are capability devices, policies, and security enforced on network access devices. It provides network visibility needed for access security, provides isolation for non-compliant devices within quarantine network. The goal is to ensure all devices wishing to join the network comply with organization requirements. Some use cases would be, like I mentioned earlier, the medical industry, IoT devices, mobile devices, and guest contracts. Network segmentation. That's an effective way to achieve defense in depth for distributing multiple and multi-tiered devices and applications. An example would be a user puts their info into a database network, all through encryption. You need to make sure the network is completely segmented for the rest of the network for some security. You can have switches that only work with an authorized individual has access to. An example would be a firewall or network traffic. Microsegmentation are tool sets of current adversaries are polymorphic in nature and allow threats to bypass static security controls. They aid in protecting against threats. They understand the protection required for traffic within a data center and traffic to and from the internet, the traffic flows. detection and prevention to threats, and they avoid infrastructure-centric design paradigms. Some key points is they allow for extremely granular restrictions within IT. They can limit which IP addresses communicate to a given machine. There's logical rules and ultimate end-of-state defense in depth. Part of zero trust strategy that breaks LANs into very small, highly localized zones using firewalls or similar technology. This places firewall at every connection point. And VLANs, like we talked about earlier, are just local group workstations that appear like a LAN, but they happen to be all over. Data security lifecycle. So the elements of data are creating, storing, using, sharing, archiving, and destroying data. And hardening is the process of applying secure configurations and locking down hardware, communication systems, and software. Data security lifecycle. So some of the practices are classification and labeling, which is determining sensitivity of data and availability, labeling according to these sensitivities. Retention is how long we store the information based on the organization's requirements. Defensible destruction is having a regulatory management data or date backing up or destroying data. Degaussing is the process of reducing or eliminating an unwanted magnetic field stored on tape and disk media. Touch more on labeling. That is when security labels are applied, things like highly restricted, moderately restricted, low sensitivity, and unrestricted. Retention, that's a practice based on the records lifecycle where records are retained as long as necessary and then destroyed within an interval of time. And the policies are influenced by legal regulations or government compliance. Personnel understand various retention requirements for data of different types throughout the organization. And one mistake would be applying longest retention period to all types of information. Destruction, that's when data that might be left on media after deleting is remnant. And remnants is residual info remaining on storage media after clearing. So purging of devices of system is eliminating chance that residual physical effects from writing original data may still be recovered. Logging and monitoring security events. Logging is the primary form of instrumentation that attempts to capture signals generated by events. Things like user IDs, dates, times of key events, successful and rejected system resource access attempts, system configuration changes, system activities. It's essential to identifying inefficient or improperly performing systems, detecting compromises, and providing a record of how systems are used. Robust logging provides tools to effectively correlate info from diverse info systems to fully understand the relationship between one activity and another. Log reviews are an essential function for security assessment and testing and identifying security incidents, policy violations, fraudulent activities, and operational problems. Some log elements are events, raw logs, and the event detail. Things like the dashboard, analysis, environment, reports, and configuration. Ingress monitoring. That is monitoring of incoming network traffic, surveillance and assessment of inbound traffic. Some devices would be firewalls, gateways, CM solutions, anti-malware software, IDS and IPS tools, and remote authentication servers. We touched on robust logging. Egress monitoring is the monitoring of outgoing network traffic. Things like data loss prevention, system capabilities designed to detect, prevent unauthorized user, things like FTP for email, copy to portable media, posting to website and pages, and APIs. Encryption. Cryptography is the study of applications and methods to secure or protect the meaning and content of messages, files, and other information, usually by disguise, obscuration, and other transformations of content and meaning. Cryptography is used to protect info by keeping it encrypted. A ciphertext would be the altered form of a plain text message, so it is unreal for anyone except the intended recipients. So you can encrypt a password, or you can encrypt a username. And an element of that encryption would be hashing. That's a process of using mathematical algorithms against data to produce a numerical value that is representation of that data. And some properties when it comes to hashing, or some hash function properties, useful, it's easy to compute hash value for any given message. Non-reversible is computational, unfeasible to reverse. Content integrity, it's infeasible to modify the message. It's unique, infeasible to find two or more different sensible messages. And finally, it's deterministic. The same input will always generate the same hash. Checksums are a digital representation of the sum of the correct digits in the piece stored or transmitted digital data, against which later comparisons can be made to detect errors in the data. Configuration management. That's a process and discipline used to ensure that only changes made to a system are authorized and validated. Some components are identification. That's a baseline identification of a system and all its components, interfaces, and documentation. The baseline is a minimal level of protection that can be used as a reference point. They provide a way to ensure that updates to the system and architecture are subjected to minimum understood security requirements. Change control is an update process for requesting changes to a baseline by making changes to one or more components in that baseline. Policies. That's a discipline of transitioning from the current to the future state. Some of the activities are: 1, the request for change. And by the way, there's multiple policies. There's the acceptable use policy, which is an organization's network and security systems can be used under legal protection. These details appropriate usage of assets, devices, and data. Some of the components are request for change. That's a change in procedure or product is sought by the stakeholder. 2 is approval. That includes evaluating the request for change for completeness, assignment to proper change authorization process based on risk and organizational practices. Stakeholder reviews, resources are identified. Authentication. Something that you know is a PIN, password, or phrase. Something that you are is a fingerprint, a photo, or biometrics. Something that you have are cookies stored in the computer, a token, or a smart card. Something that you are is the location, identity, the IP, or the MAC address. And type 5 is a signature or pattern unlock. Context-based access control is access to object based on parameters like time, location, access history, and sequence of response. More exam prep. The policy or procedure outlined by the company is an admin control. Risk avoidance is eliminating the risk entirely. Non-repudiation is if the user does something, they can't claim they didn't do it later. Risk management is all about avoidance, acceptance, and mitigation in that order. A procedure is a document that describes step-by-step way of doing something. Using secrecy would be an example of confidentiality in the CIA triad. Incident detection is brief investigation that user accounts has been compromised. That'd be an example. Intrusion is an external entity tried to gain access to your organization's IT environment. Data backup is used in disaster recovery. Checklist associated for disaster recovery planning. A goal of that plan would be employees return to the primary production location as soon as possible. An example of a subject would be a user. Turnstiles would address the risk of following someone. A router is a network device to connect networks. A firewall filters traffic. Port 80 is an endpoint to a web server. A DDoS attack is an attack against availability of the network. Finally, data lifecycle is used to map data flows through an organization and relevant security controls used at each point along the way. Make sure to subscribe for more content in cybersecurity.